I now want to discuss a type of deviation from the resting membrane potential known as graded potentials. These are the potentials that occur in the cell body and the dendrites in response to a stimulation from another cell, or in the case of sensory receptors, from an external stimulus. Graded potentials are called graded because if there is a small stimulus, there will be a small response. If there's a larger stimulus, there will be a larger response, and if there is a very large stimulus, there will be a very large response. So the response is graded to the stimulus. The second characteristic of graded potentials is something called decremental conduction. And what happens here is as the graded potential travels through the cell body or the dendrite, its amplitude is going to decrease. The third characteristic of these graded potentials is something called summation. These graded potentials can add up. So if you were to have multiple stimuli very close together, and this graded response did not have time to return to the resting membrane potential before it was stimulated again, the response will add, and this is known as summation. If the graded response is a depolarization, this is potentially bringing the cell to threshold. So this is a depolarization, and it's potentially bringing the cell to threshold, in which case an action potential could potentially be generated in the axon hillock. It is potentially exciting the cell. So this type of response is excitatory. If a graded response hyperpolarizes the cell, what it's doing is it's taking it away from threshold. In this case, it is not exciting the cell, but it is inhibiting it. So it is going to be inhibitory. So a hyperpolarization, making the membrane potential more negative, is going to be inhibitory. Looking at two cells communicating with each other, the information is coming down the axon from one cell and is going to reach the end of the cell, and this area here is called the synaptic bulb. The information then has to cross the synapse and then is going to elicit a response in the cell body. It is in the cell body, or we could also potentially be talking about the dendrites, where these graded responses are occurring. So, looking at the orientation of these cells, if this is the synapse, this is the presynaptic cell, and this is the postsynaptic cell. So the graded responses we're talking about in the cell body are postsynaptic potentials, or PSPs. The responses of the cell body can either be a depolarization, which are excitatory responses, and we've just discussed that they would be postsynaptic potentials, so they are called excitatory postsynaptic potentials. The other option, the other possibility, is that it could be hyperpolarized, in which case it's going to be an IPSP, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. I want to discuss for a minute about the concept of summation. If you have an inhibitory postsynaptic potential combined with an excitatory postsynaptic potential, these two could add up. Okay, you have an EPSP and an IPSP. They could add up to be 0. Again, continuing with the concept of summation, if you had a small EPSP plus another small EPSP, that would add up to be a large EPSP. Similarly, if you had a small IPSP plus another small IPSP, they could add up to be a large iPSP. Here we have a cell that has 3 neurons converging on it. Remember the concept of convergence? Many neurons converging or sending signals to one cell. So in this case, let's say that the one neuron generates an ePSP in the cell body, whereas another neuron is going to generate an iPSP. And then the third one we will say is generating another ePSP. Remembering the concept of decremental conduction, as these travel towards the cell body, towards the axon hillock, these are going to decrease in amplitude. Similarly, the iPSP is going to decrease in amplitude. So what matters to the cell is what happens at the axon hillock. That is where the cell body is going to join up with the axon. At that point, these are the potentials that it is going to add up to determine whether the cell is going to reach threshold or whether it is not. The concept I just discussed in the previous slide was spatial summation. That was due to the convergence of different neurons to that one cell body. Now I want to just discuss the concept of temporal summation. Let's say that this neuron is firing and it generates an ePSP in the postsynaptic cell. If this cell here fires very rapidly, what's going to happen is before it can return to the resting membrane potential, that response can add together. Okay? And when this is due to increased firing rate, this is called temporal summation. So we have spatial summation due to the orientation of all of these cells converging on the one cell. Right here, right here, right here. Different locations on the cell. That's the spatial summation. The temporal summation is due to the firing rate of the one cell. And you must appreciate now that the actual total summation is going to be a combination of both spatial and temporal summation. As these graded potentials reach the axon hillock and summation has occurred, we are going to now assume that this graded response has reached threshold. And now what's going to happen at the axon hillock is that this response right here is coming up, and then we are going to generate an action potential. So the difference between action potentials and graded responses is that the action potential is all or none. It's either going to get a full amplitude action potential or you will get nothing. So in the case that if this response was a sub-threshold stimulus, you would have still got the depolarization, but you would not have got the action potential. So all or none. Here's the graded response coming in from the cell body. Assuming that it is an excitatory postsynaptic potential, which has been the result of temporal and spatial summation, if it reaches threshold, it will generate an action potential, and you will get the full amplitude of that action potential. If, however, the stimulus coming in from the cell body and the dendrite was sub-threshold, you do not get the action potential, and that is the none part of the all or none action potential.